Hey, what's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. And this week, we're going to be getting into this idea of the social and emotional aspect of development during early adulthood. And last week, we had talked about the physical and cognitive aspect of early adult development. So this week, we're going to kind of do the second piece of that and really get into the social and emotional uh, layers of analysis. I hope you're doing well, hanging in there. I know it's can be trying times right now, but I hope that you can relax, grab a pen and a piece of paper and a coffee or whatever, and just hopefully enjoy this presentation. All right, reach out if you need me about anything, and let's get to it. Cheers. All right, let's get into this. So, um, anyways, just wanted to say I hope you're doing okay. I know I already kind of said this on the last slide, but um, I enjoyed doing this class. I've said it to you before. I'll probably say it again. I'm doing this in the basement by myself, so I have to try to talk to you at least a little bit, not just say slide related content constantly. Okay, so what I'd like you to have here is this idea that the first 20 years of our life lays the foundation for our social emotional development for the rest of our life. And this is a kind of really important concept. It's the first bullet point sort of there, that some of these attachment styles that attachment relationships that we talked about in the first part of the course are still having effect later. So I just want to read something to you. In a retrospective study, so in a study asking people to look back, retrospective, Cindy Hazen and Philip Shaver, 1987, revealed that young adults who were securely attached to their romantic relationships were more likely to describe their early relationships with their parents as securely attached. Okay, so let me just say that again. Young adults who were securely attached in their romantic relationships were more likely to describe their early relationships with their parents as securely attached. In a longitudinal study, so that just means like a study done with the same people at, I've maybe already said this to you, but instead of just asking people their opinion once, maybe you ask them every year so you can look at how their opinions have changed over time, over a long period of time, longitudinal. As opposed to just like a one-time snapshot, which is a lot of survey research. Anyways, that has nothing to do with my point. In a longitudinal study, infants who were securely attached at age 1 were securely attached 20 years later in their adult relationship. So actually, it's directly relevant, right? So it's this idea of like, if you're looking at how they score an attachment when they're 1, infants, yeah, 2, 3, 4, and you keep checking it. This is one of the things about attachment that's so interesting, is that it has stability. It's like the title of the slide, stability and change. Why does any of this stuff matter? Well, because it's not all just like random stuff. Things influence things down the road. And so understanding how attachment relationships form this map of what relationship even is to the mind of the child is so core to understanding human psychology and human relationship and human emotion and thought and self-representation in the mind. So I'm halfway through the first slide and already ranting. This might be a fun one. But let me just do that sentence over now. So this point was that in this longitudinal study, infants were securely attached at 1, were more securely attached later. So these are 2 different studies, 2 different methodologies, both with basically the same finding. Another longitudinal study revealed that securely attached infants were in more stable romantic relationships in adulthood than their insecurely attached counterparts. Yet another longitudinal study found that insecure avoidant attachment at age 8 was linked to lower levels of social initiative and prosocial behavior, and actually higher levels of social anxiety and loneliness at age 21. So that's a devastating study. There's a lot in that sentence. Let me just do that last sentence again. And again, I'm not expecting you're writing this down. This is kind of the core points I want you to know for tests or whatever are going to be on the slides, and then I'm kind of expanding on this. So I said here, he had another longitudinal, so a study done over time, right? So they're comparing when the kid's 8 to 21, that when they're 8, if they scored as an insecure avoidant attachment, that score was linked to lower levels of social initiative, so they're less likely to initiate social interaction, like engage, go up to somebody, what we would call like an approach behavior. They display less pro-social behavior in general, score higher social anxiety, and higher loneliness scores at 21. Right, so why am I starting with all this longitudinal study stuff? Well, because it's saying, like, it's like we're about to in a second get into the big 5 personality, and we're going to talk about why that matters. And one of the points I'm going to make is, if I was to give you the survey today and you scored a certain way, and then I gave you it next week and you scored different, and I gave it to you 2 years from now and you scored different, then it would kind of show that the survey means nothing. It doesn't have any predictive power. There's no validity and reliability in it, which is actually not true of Big 5. There's a lot of stability in it, right? So I'm making a really kind of circular point here, but what I'm trying to say is, one of the things that's interesting in psychology is why some things maintain and why some things change. It's stability and change. And I just want to make a point about these 3 attachment styles. Okay, so you have written down this idea that, you know, kids that have developed the secure attachment, and think of again what that means, that the child is almost like born with this ability to form this significant early relational model, and that model then gets projected, isn't the right word, but operationalized in future relationships as a model, operationalized model. Human beings are so fascinating, and so the quality of that model matters, right? And if that model is secure and based on trust, right? We spent so much time early in the course talking about Erickson's ideas about trust, and it's so key, right? Whereas if the child's developed more of an avoidance style, you know, it's like you could probably finish, most of you now at this point in the course, you could finish my sentences for me at this point with this, right? And it's like a child that's developed this avoidance style is going to be more hesitant, going to be less likely to trust. They're hesitant about romantic relationships. You know, a child that's developed a sense of anxious attachment, which we would have called it. This kind of clinginess, but also not trusting. Anxious. Right? And so that the idea here is that these early years are laying the foundation for adult social and emotional development. So that's like an 8-minute first slide. How do you like that? All right, let's keep going. So in psychology, there's a word that you might want to write down that's actually, if you're taking written notes along with this, that is an interesting word that's called psychometrics, right? So it's like psycho, like most of the word psychology, psycho, and then metrics, meaning to measures, to sort of psychologically measure. And you're probably familiar with different kinds of psychometrics. The most famous one being like an IQ test, obviously, or like even this Ocean's Big 5 personalities index. And what that is it's basically saying this idea that's actually really interesting, that there's these 5 things. So just a quick side note, that's why you'll sometimes hear this called a 5-factor analysis. It's like, it sounds super complicated. All it means is that you'll notice there's 5 letters, 5 variables, where this is a scale that scores you on openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and what used to be called neuroticism and is being called more emotional stability now. So the fact that there's those 5 variables is why it's called the 5-factor analysis. So let me just say a few things about this. because I want to actually talk a little bit about this and he's like, yeah, Mike, obviously you're going to talk about this, but I want to talk a little bit about where this comes from, why this matters, why it's significant, what a 5-factor model is, how do you get it down to 5 factors, scale development. I just want to talk a little bit about psychometrics for a sec, because it's something that I used to be like super interested in. I think it's just something to discuss, because what does it mean to say that you have a different personality score than someone else? Like, let's step back and answer that question first. It's like, I didn't get along with this person at my work because of their personality. Well, what exactly do you mean by that? And what this team of researchers, so I'm going to talk about Costa and McCrae. So Paul Costa and Robert McCrae. I should have this in a way that I can. Okay, so the last name, Paul Costa, Costa, and then Robert McCrae, which is like M small c and then big C R-A-E. And I know that's weird, but I know some of you are writing it, and so maybe spelling it's actually easier. So these are just two psychological researchers that are more in like the statistics level. And what a 5-factor analysis is you realize you start asking people all these questions about themselves, but you realize that there's overlap. So if I'm asking you, like, you know, how happy you are and how much you smile on an average day and how many nice things you see and blah, blah, blah. And I ask all these things and I start to realize, like, if I just realize kind of your overall pleasantness, I can actually predict your answer on a bunch of things. And what they start realizing is, like, let me find an example. Well, here, sorry, instead of just freestyling an explanation, let me read what I have written. A major study of adult personality was developed and continues to be conducted to this day by Paul Costa and Robert McCrae. They focus on what's called the big 5-factor of personality. This thing that you've probably heard of before: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, sometimes called the ocean model, just as a mnemonic for remembering it, just a memory tool. Using this 5-factor personality test, Costa and McCrae studied approximately 1,000 college-educated men and women aged 20 to 96, assessing the same individual over many years. Data collection began in the mid-50s to mid-60s and is ongoing today. So all that means is that they started some people in the 50s, some people in the 60s, and they've been continuing with those people in long-term follow-up, right? Because they're trying to get to what we were saying on the last slide, this stability thing. Data collection began in the 50s and 60s, and I just said that, but Costa and McCrae concluded that considerable stability exists across the adult years for the 5 personality traits. I'm just going to add a piece on each of these 5. Actually, you know what? I'm going to save this point for just the next slide. I'll catch you on the flip here. Okay, so this is what I mean by 5 factors. So you see here how this graph, I know as long as you have this in your notes somehow and you can reproduce this on the test, you'll be fine. That's a bad joke. In person, I sometimes do jokes like that where I'll put up like a really complicated graph and say something like that. And if I had like a cricket sound effect right now, I would play it. You don't have to know this graph, but what I'm trying to show here is how they actually break down and how create profiles based on scores. And that actually, when you're asking about openness, you're asking about things like people's engagement in mental fantasy, that their connection with things like aesthetics and feelings and actions and ideas and values, and there'd be questions about all of those 6 subcomponents. When we're talking about extroversion, we're talking about how warm people are, how gregarious they are, like how much they like have to like steal the center of the show. Right? When we're talking about agreeableness, we're talking about trust, straightforwardness, altruism, how compliance people have, modesty, tenderness, right? So the idea here, though, is that understanding your score on this, and it's actually interesting. I'm going to provide a link to the test if you want. I had my wife do it to see if it was like the way I presented made sense. And she didn't like her score. I'll talk a little bit about why maybe over the course of the lecture, because I think you might find it interesting. But again, it's like there's no right or wrong score. People are different on different variables. The reality is a lot of you, if you take the test, you're going to score higher. You're going to score higher than normal on neuroticism. And part of it is because right now we live in a world that there's a lot of anxiety, and neuroticism is an old word that is probably better replaced now with the term emotional stability. So it's like neuroticism, people that score high on that, it doesn't sound good because it sounds like, oh, I don't want to sound like I score high in neuroticism. But what that really is meaning is this tendency towards worrying, towards feeling anxious, towards worrying about what people think. Right? It's not the incorrect use of the word neurotic. So as you can see there, it's almost like a language issue at a certain point. But yeah, I would, if it, in some ways it'd be cool if all of you have done your Big Five personality test, because it's interesting though. Like me and my wife then talked about it, and we had interesting conversations. Because like, for example, she scores a lot higher than me in openness, and that's one of the reasons why like I kind of like things that I know I like. Like it's like I kind of want to go to the trail that I know I like if we're going for a walk, and then, order takeout from like Eastside Mario's. I know I like that. I'll get a nice little chicken parm. Whereas like she wants to do something new and wants to blah blah blah, and it's like, okay, well, it's interesting to see that this test actually captured that. So again, you could take the test and it's pretty straightforward. But what's it kind of trying to say? There's almost like different personality types, styles. So let me read this now. Okay, so after all that lead up, openness to experience. So I'm going to go through these one at a time. Openness to experience. You don't have to worry about writing this down. These individuals are more likely to have superior cognitive functioning achievement, IQ, across the lifespan, show creative achievement in arts, experience less negative effect to stressors. Openness to experience is actually, it's funny because I just said that I scored really low on it. There's such a tendency with any kind of scored thing like this to want to think like one score is better than a different score, right? But conscientiousness is a good example, because conscientiousness is like how much people follow rules and are like focused on time. And it's like, yeah, you don't want to be super low on conscientiousness and be like considered like really lazy and that you never get things done. But you could also stress yourself out being too high in conscientiousness. So there's this, again, that's why there's all these different kind of combinations and stuff. It's just an interesting tool, especially if you're like in a long-term relationship with someone. It'd be interesting for both of you to do it and then talk about it. Conscientiousness. Individuals high in conscientiousness have better health, less stress, engage in superior problem solving and coping, tend to be more successful at accomplishing goals, right? Students that are high in conscientiousness tend to do better because they tend to, show up to class, take notes, listen, follow instructions on assignments, do the assignments well, get them in on time, move on to the next thing, time manage well. So I'm kind of highlighting the positive aspects of these, I guess. Extroversion. So this is the one you've probably heard the most of and need me to explain the least, the difference between extroversion and introversion. But this idea of people, an interesting example is you might think I actually score high on introversion. So it's like I'm not as extroverted as you think, and my wife scores higher on extroversion, even though she'd be nervous probably presenting in a class like this. Whereas to me, I could do this all day at a certain level, you know what I mean? Like in terms of lecturing or whatever. But you've probably heard this maybe before, but one of the things that's important, it's like, say we both have had a long week, like what do you want to do on that Saturday if all of a sudden you have some free time? And it's like, my wife would like love to go and spend the time with her sisters and go and do activities and stuff. And it's like, for me, I kind of want to like, watch a Raptors game and have a Subway sandwich and just relax. And it's like, How do you recharge is an important question for whether you're introverted or extroverted. Right? Agreeableness. I know I'm spending forever on this slide, so I'll wrap this up. Agreeableness. People that are high in agreeableness are more likely to be generous, altruistic, have more satisfying romantic relationships. That's an interesting point. Right? This is according to their research. This isn't just my opinion. Tend to engage in more, and that kind of makes sense, right? Like, to an extent, again, it's not saying like you should be a pushover, but it's saying like if you argue every single point in every relationship you're in, I don't know how to say it, it might be less enjoyable for the other person. And then right, it's interesting that what I have written here is that when people score high in neuroticism, it's all often linked with coronary heart issues, right? So risks to the heart. I think that's a pretty easy argument to make, that anxiety is hard on the heart. Yeah, so it's in some ways this is the most validated psychometrics it's the most validated psychometric that we have, I think, still, other than IQ. And all that means is that people have tried this in different situations so many times and tried to validate it. It's a quite strong psychometric. Anyways, you guys are probably about ready for me to move to the next topic, so let's do this. So this is it's not a perfect segue, but switching topics. Another huge thing we're going to talk about today, and I kind of hinted at this last week, that to Erickson, the big thing that you're dealing with at this stage is around intimacy. And I had made the point that like intimacy isn't just romantic relationships, that it involves creating healthy, supportive, rewarding relationships at all levels of life, but that it also does include, that romantic relationships. And one thing that we're going to talk a little bit about today is like marriage and divorce and ideas around that, and what psychology has to say about that, and kind of specifically what a researcher named Gottman has to say about that. So I want to just kind of talk about this for a sec, because I should have waited and made this point and then brought up that point. But because what's the most common thing you always hear about marriages? That like most marriages fail, blah blah blah. You hear everybody has a different stat. Now, a lot of marriages do fail, and a lot of marriages that fail early. But there's actually interesting research that looks at that once marriages get to year 8, that the rate of divorce drops to nearly zero. So like under 1%, which is a really kind of interesting finding that doesn't get talked about a lot, that actually, and it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, because you're establishing a lot of those patterns, and if those patterns can be established in a healthy, sustainable way. Yeah, so it's a misleading stat to say that over half end in divorce, or whatever you hear people say. It's like, okay, it's important. What I'm going to get into in a second, I'm going to try to do this without sounding like preachy at all, because this course isn't about relationship advice, but it's also at the same time about looking at what psychology has to say about what's more likely to move things in a healthy, growth promoting perspective or direction, because we know that married adults tend to live longer, tend to be happier, tend to be healthier, tend to have like quite literally lower rates of psychiatric disturbance on the kind of whole mental health spectrum. Life is difficult. And I'm going to make a point later that like at a certain point, if you're involved in a long-term relationship with someone, like whether you're legally married or not, it's like the level of that psychological connection that I'm really talking about. And like I was just about to make the point that like life's tough, and it's like I don't have to tell you that, but having someone to do the battle with, makes there's a reason why it's linked with like happiness and health and living longer and lower rates of psychiatric disturbances. I know sometimes I joke about my wife or whatever, and sometimes it's just me trying to be funny and or just trying to be honest and share a little bit about myself, right? But the psychological literature is quite clear that. But then again, I'm gonna talk about some variations in a sec. So, but yeah, I think let's see what Goffman has to say. So Gottman has this idea. So I want you to have this, please, in your note. And Gottman has these 5 principles, and I think the textbook talks about it, so you can kind of get this. I'm a little bit more drawn out, but I think we can kind of just chat about the basic idea. And I'll try not to like blush and be all awkward sometimes whenever I just talking about like love and stuff makes me, I don't know why, but I'll try not to. Okay, so anyways, establishing love maps, this idea of like, now, it's actually a really important idea. It says, individuals in successful marriages have personal insights and detailed maps of each other's life and world. They're not psychological strangers. It's a great point. In good marriages, partners are willing to share their feelings with each other. They use these love maps to express not only their understandings of each other, but their fondness of and admiration. It's like the stories they tell each other, the way that they tell the stories. So again, you can probably see how this would translate to, like, say, couples therapy, and it would be like they would, and if Gottman was working with a couple, he would have them work on these love stories and try to articulate what is it about the other person, and they would have homework working on stuff like this. This idea of nurturing fondness and admiration. In successful marriages, partners sing each other's praises. More than 90% of the time, when couples put a positive spin on their marriage history, the marriage is likely to have a positive future. Let me say that again. When couples put a positive spin on the marriage's history, not necessarily lying about things, but not having to focus on the bitter piece, a positive spin. When couples put a positive spin on their history, the marriage is more likely to have a positive future. I actually have written, you can see, I don't know if you can see it in bold there, but it's like the second last point near the bottom. I have it written in bold, not in bold, but in capitals. Remember, positive spin is very different than accepted delusion. Okay, turning toward each other instead of away. In good marriages, spouses are adept or good at turning towards each other regularly. Oh, that hits so core, right? That's such good but brutal relationship advice. It's like, because when we're in a fight, and you've probably experienced it in your own life, whenever you're in an argument, there's also this desire to like isolate, right? To like pull away. Gottman's instead suggesting turning towards. And that there's actually, this is where his point is around having a friendship aspect to this. They see each other also as friends, that this friendship doesn't keep arguments from occurring, but it can prevent those differences from overwhelming the relationship. And in good marriages, spouses respect each other and appreciate each other's point of view despite disagreements. Number 4, letting your partner influence you. The more open partners are to each other's ideas and choices, the more likely they are to respect and learn from each other. Again, that's another hard one. Let your partner influence you, because it's tough hearing about like any kind of criticism, obviously, is what I mean. So let me just start that again, sorry. The more open partners are to each other's ideas and choices, the more likely they are to respect and learn from each other. That's totally true. This in turn increases the chances that they'll achieve a more cohesive union based on their differences as well as their similarities. And then this important kind of final point that draws it together about creating shared meaning. The more partners can speak candidly and respectfully with each other, the more likely they are to create a shared meaning in their marriage. This can include shared goals, that they're working together, helping each other achieve goals. Right? It's like in this crazy world, it's like to have a successful long-term relationship, to understand it as having this huge psychological component is useful.
I would say love is something everybody talks about, and the need for love is one of the most basic needs of man, namely the experience of union with another being, of becoming one with another being. And yet I would say that love today is a relatively rare phenomenon, that we have a great deal of sentimentality, we have a great deal of illusion about love, namely as something one falls in, but the question is that one cannot fall in love really, one has to be in love, and that means that loving becomes, and the ability to love, becomes one of the most important things in life.
Why is it so difficult for us to be in love as human beings? What is wrong with us, as you see it?
Because we are concerned with things, we are concerned with success, we are concerned with money, we are concerned with instrumentalities. And the most important things we talk about on Sundays are things to which we pay very little attention. Love is not easy. All great religions postulate love as one of the greatest accomplishments. If it were that easy, or as easy as most people think, certainly the great religious leaders would have been rather naive.
I like this quote, and I think it kind of really gets to the center of what I'm trying to say, is that a lot of what's going to make a marriage work long term is going to be the ability to handle problems as they arise and deal with things and the interpersonal dynamics and dealing with stress and dealing with life challenges and health and all kinds of things. So, this quote says, to make marriage work, partners need to develop a deep friendship, to show respect for each other, to embrace commitment, this kind of psychological commitment to each other. That's a point I've already said, and I'll make a few times, is like, it's that psychological commitment that's so key. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that as we move forward here. Friends, what's up? At this point, you're like 40 minutes or so into the video. For me, this is now a couple days later. That last part of it's crazy because I recorded the first part of this presentation just a couple nights ago, but it seems like such a different world. That's like, yeah, if you don't know what I'm talking about, the kids are going back to school next week. Which for parents across Ontario is massive. Without even talking about the pandemic stuff, it's like just the fact that you can probably imagine, just I teach this class and also work full time at the college, and then having Evie home doing 4 Zooms a day, and my wife home doing her Zoom all day. Anyways, it's just gonna be nice to get stabilizing routine back a little bit more. But anyways, that's just, now it's a couple days later. I'm recording this part on Friday night, Evie's sleeping, and yeah, so for you this is just going to be a continuous video, but it's kind of like part 2. And by the end of part 1, it was getting pretty late one day, and I had to teach I was trying to get out Monday. I really honestly tried to get this video out Monday. Then I just started getting really conscious of the fact that I had a 3-hour lecture at 9 the next morning, and once I started to get close to 2, and I know Eve gets up early, it's just like, you know how you start to do math in your head. So I'd ended last time talking about, I'd shared that quote just about marriage and the core importance of psychological connection and commitment. And is this recording? Yeah, I think so. And I want to keep going on this, in this idea of what, and again, I want to also make the point that a lot of the points I'm going to make in terms of things that are important for marital success are true in a long-term relationship, even if there isn't a legal marriage. So obviously I'm saying the value of a certain type of psychological relationship, which I think is an important point of clarification. So this is the first thing I want you to have, is that, maybe I'll put down a couple things. That couples can be great with very different interests. It's these kind of core values that are really important. And it's so interesting, like how that actually plays out. But it's like, I think maybe me and my wife are good examples in some ways, because like we couldn't be more different in a lot of ways. And what is similar about us, I think, is the values, right? And it's like the importance of family and truth and honesty and stuff like that. And it's like or whatever, it's more than just that kind of stuff. But when there's that kind of core alignment, the different in interests, it just kind of adds richness to it. Personality traits of partners are important, and things like, and this is why neuroticism, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but can be straining on relationships. And again, I think it's such a complex thing, because it's all about fit and it's all about understanding. And it's actually when you understand that there's for example, so all I'm saying by that is saying that, like, when one partner has a lot of negative emotion, it's hard on the relationship. And if you say it in that language, it's not super hard to understand the point, right? That next thing, though, that's really important is the attitudes that people have towards divorce seem to have a statistically significant effect on how likely people actually are to divorce. And what that means is, like, if people are viewing, if this doesn't work out, how much you think divorce is sort of a big deal. I'm not talking about in like extreme situations where, I'm talking more like people's attitudes to how much they view it as a potential option actually affects how much they rate their satisfaction in the marriage. Which is kind of interesting. Like, couples unopposed to divorce report more dissatisfaction in general with marriage. And so the point in the psychological literature is that maybe a piece of that is that a little bit of your mind thinking like, if this doesn't work, then this, and having backup plans, and that actually is something you need to, not morally, but psychologically, you need to let go of if marital and long-term relational success is the goal. And then this last point that's also super important and ties us right back to the beginning of the last course is this idea that attachment variables still matter. Right? So those early relationships, and that's maybe not super surprising, that the attachment trust people develop early in life has an effect on marriage, like maybe their next biggest relationship. Interesting topic. Hey, it's a Friday night. I don't have nothing to do. It's lockdown. My wife and daughter are both asleep. I feel blessed that I can, come on the computer and make a video that I know you'll watch and hopefully get something out of. And anyways, I just wanted to say I appreciate this relationship. So next slide. So let's talk about love. Okay. So can you have this definition somewhere? Because we're about to get into the work of Sternberg and the components of what he called consummate love. But first, let's just get this idea, right? So in this course, we're referring to love as meaning a vast, complex territory of human behavior, spanning a range of relationships that include intimacy, friendship, romantic love, affectionate love, consummate love. Okay, so one of the core components we're going to be talking about is the variable of intimacy. And again, remember, like, this is the definitional variable for this life stage, this struggle between intimacy and isolation. And so intimacy here, we have this idea of like a core part of deep relationship is the ability to share things, right? Like, part of the thing is, like, if you've been in this course since September or whatever, you've been hearing me talk for a long time, and like that's one of the reasons I share a little bit of personal stuff that's like, maybe it's like, why would I say that? But it's like, I don't know, it's a little bit of self-disclosure. I try not to do too much of it, but just kind of humanizes it a little bit, I hope. A little bit of the sharing of private thoughts, like to just share with you, like the fact that I kind of feel like I got my gas tank filled back up just by the fact that Evie's going back to school, and like I love having her at home, but like I have so much stuff on the back burner that I just need to do, right? So anyways, it's just like a productivity change that I'm really excited about, and it's just, that's just one piece of it. The other piece of it is just how good it is for her. Anyways, okay, enough of that. I'm sorry. I'm done. But even the fact that my point I was making there is that like the self-disclosure is a piece of relationship. Like at a certain point, you could just use a text-to-voice app to read you slides. I'm trying to, do more than read slides, to actually add some emotional content and hopefully make it interesting. That adolescents have an increase, and as we get older, right, that we get this increased need for intimacy, and this links with identity, and we see these as like the core. And this is going to be the first assignment that I'm going to make a video explaining about soon, like really soon. We're going to get into this idea of identity and intimacy and how they link, right? Because first of all, I think it has a lot of relevancy to a lot of you probably, and it's because it's dealing with this idea of how we see ourselves and how that relates to our ability to establish healthy long-term relationships. And then those are those are Erickson's stages right in a row, and are just so core to establishing things for what's moving forward later. Right, so that next point, that managing the demands of intimacy and identity and independence, my camera's covering a bit, but it just says independence, becomes the central task of adulthood. Who are you? Who do you want to be around? Who don't you want to be around? Who don't you want to be? What do you believe? That a big part of becoming an adult is this interaction between establishing intimacy and identity. All right, next slide. So here's Sternberg's theory of love. And I'm going to show you, we're going to go over this more in like textual ways and like just in words, and like actually get some definitions and map out this theory in just a second. But I think this image actually shows this in a really descriptive way, where it's like basically what he's doing is he's making labels for different types of relationships, and he's classifying based on 3 variables. Okay, so I want you to know this definitely for the test, right? So that's like commitment, intimacy, and passion, and that these relationship types, whether we're talking about liking someone or romantic love or infatuation or what he calls consummate love or companion love or empty love or fatuous or fake love, surface level love I should say, that it's a combination of either just 1, 2, or 3 of these variables. So you'll see, right, it's like at a certain point passion is, well, just the passion variable, and then when you add that with intimacy, it's what he calls romantic love. But if you add that with there's no intimacy, but there's passion and commitment without the psychological intimacy, he would call that more like a surface level love. Or if there's the commitment and the intimacy but without the passion, he'd call that like a companion, like a friendship style love. Right? And so consummate love is what he's saying, that like, so you can see how this would relate to something like marriage therapy, and it's like about developing all three aspects of this triangle, and like the consummate, or what is like kind of a word meaning like the most complete, total, collaborative, well, it's the full triangle, is this combination of commitment, intimacy, and passion. So now we're going to kind of branch this out and get into some more details. Okay, so I'm going to kill the video just for this slide because I have that image there. But so now think of this. This is this idea of, okay, intimacy, feelings that promote closeness and connectedness. You know that, but it's this, remember we're saying the psychological level of this, the feelings that promote this emotional bonding, this deep connectedness, passion, the feelings of intense longing for union with the other person. That also includes sexual tension, commitment to a particular other, so this psychological commitment to a single person over a long period of time. So Sternberg has this idea that there's these three components of what we would consider psychological love, and it includes this intimacy, passion, and commitment. And it's not, it doesn't exist in perfect ways. Well, perfect's not the right word, but it doesn't exist in consummate ways in all relationships, and some relationships lack a key one of these tri-elements, these three elements, three key components to relationship quality. That's an important point, actually. I should have started with the title of the slide, is that really this relates to relationship quality in general, not just marriages, obviously. So just as a heads up, you might want to make a note that an easy test question would be to give you some kind of example of a relationship and ask you what kind of relationship it is based on the presence or the lack of presence of those three variables, right? So Sternberg's idea was that consummate love, remember, he's doing all this research on the psychology of relationships. He's studying all these different types of couples, and what he basically comes down to is that the ones that succeed have these three variables: commitment, passion, and intimacy, right? And that the fullest form of love is what he calls consummate love, that it has these three elements: this passion, this physical sexual attraction, this intimacy, emotional feelings of warmth, closeness, sharing in a relationship, and then the commitment, the cognitive appraisal. So see, that's an interesting kind of different way. I haven't said it that way yet, because what's a commitment at a certain point? Think of the term there, cognitive appraisal. It's like when the person thinks about the other person, they think about that relationship as having as existing in the future. And when both people are acting in a relationship from a position where they're viewing it as something that will exist in the future, they behave differently in the present, is the idea that he presents. Cognitive appraisal of relationship and intent to maintain relationship even in the face of problems that are inevitably going to affect any relationship. Okay, so if I could have you get the definitions down for these three things. So these are three types of relationships that aren't consummate love, right? Where all those three variables that Sternberg has been talked about aren't present. So for example, infatuation or infatuated relationships, he would say that the passion's there, but the intimacy and commitment are lacking. So you can see this pictorially represented on the right here, where the dark blue represents that variable is present, and the gray represents that it's absent. Where with affectionate love, the relationship might be lacking in passion, but high in the other two. and just think about what affectionate means, like an emotional relationship where there's a lot of emotional closeness, maybe a lot of commitment, but maybe the passion sort of died down, right? Which Sternberg would say is like often the case, and that's one of the things that would be worked on then, right? So a lot of times it's an issue with one of these three variables. So then fatuous love in this situation where there's the passion and the commitment, but that the relationship, so this is where fatuous is kind of, you can put in your notes, kind of like surface level, and just kind of think what that would mean. It could be like really physically passionate, could be committed, but could lack that psychological intimacy and depth. Okay, I just wanted to make a quick point. I found a couple cool videos that I wanted to add that if you're at this point, you've already watched them. One was Eric Fromm and one was Viktor Frankl. Both of those, I wanted to make the point, they both referenced how, especially from he's like a man's job in life, or why it's so important. And I think if they were saying it again in 2021, they would make reference to the fact that they're obviously talking about man as mankind, and this is all relevant to women too. I don't know really what to say about it other than I think that if those two were talking in today's society, they would say it differently. I just think that's an important point to make. Just as families evolve, so do the interpersonal relationships at the heart of family life. Yep. But I hope that you enjoyed those videos. Sometimes I'm going to include videos that are really cool from hopefully say for example back last term when we did like the early biological beginnings, and some of them are like animations and stuff, but sometimes I want to show some stuff that might be a bit dated, but it's classic footage of the history of psychology and some of these people that we've been talking about. And I think it's hard to beat just you need to be exposed to just the history, the raw footage. Common challenges faced by single adults is this idea of being in this life stage where you have a challenge to try to form intimate relationships with other people, and confronting some of the loneliness that might be associated with struggling to doing that. And oh man, not even to mention obviously how much all this lockdown and COVID and social, physical, whatever isolation, it's been crazy long now, and we're all getting a little bit of cabin fever, and just missing normal interactions. Yeah, and then I wanted to have this term too, and you'll all know this term, but I wanted to make the point of cohabitation. The textbook talks a lot about this as just like a kind of way of defining a relationship where it's a sexual relationship with the commitment long term, but without, and the living together. Maybe the commitment long term, maybe I shouldn't have said that part, although it's often would be the case. But it's the combination of being in a sexual relationship, not marriage, but actually living together, cohabitating, just living together. That's not a super huge point, but that's an important point because in the literature they use that term and make the point that the difference in, say for example, how marriage is linked to better scores on mental health. If people are cohabitating and in a committed long-term relationship, the effect is almost the same. So it's like the benefit is associated with the psychology around the situation to a degree. It's kind of the idea. So now, this here's a kind of interesting point because it's basically, we're going to look at this idea that in any relationship that probably you've ever been in, or, especially as you're having adult relationships or whatever, adult relationships, I think you know what I mean, just this idea of if you're going to be with someone long term and you're going to maybe even live together or have kids together or vacation together or buy a car together, or the chances of having some kind of conflict are really high, and it's more about how those things are managed and processed when they come up. And it's I'm not going to try to preach as if I'm always perfect at it, but I want to share a couple ideas here. First of all, that there's what we call or what we can classify as validating. So think about like if I'm, say this was like a live class and you're all like here on Zoom or whatever, and I'm talking and I make some point and someone's like, oh yeah, good point. It's like they kind of validate my point. They're like, it's like supportive of it. So it's like in validating couples, there's often disagreements, but there's kind of this like mutual underlying respect and listening to each other, and they kind of validate each other. They're not stone cold shouldering each other, right? Which is more avoidant couples, which is where we tend to see the most likelihood of breakdown. In volatile, I meant to say, so think of what volatile means. It's like if you have like a chemistry, for some reason I'm thinking of like a chemistry set, and you have like a chemistry beaker and you throw something in and it's like that's very volatile, that substance. It's like, so a volatile couple where there's a lot of fighting, or a lot of squabble, I say there, or just like disagreements and stuff like that. Not a lot of good listening skills. But the interesting thing is that even in relationships like that, if there's more kind of positive than negative, they tend to, and especially if there's the addition of laughter and affection, those couples can be okay. It's the couples that really struggle is when the talking stops and the cold shoulder starts, right? So again, this is kind of, without trying to sound preachy, the advice would be from psychology, if the goal is long-term sustainability, or if the goal is a long-term healthy relationship, maintaining communication channels is absolutely key, and processing difficult things that come through those channels is the name of the game. So can you have this in your notes, please, that the research is quite clear that the couples most likely to divorce are when it's situations where there's a lot of fighting and not a lot of counter positive, right? So, and there's kind of the two types of hostile. So sometimes it's hostile and still very engaged, but sometimes it's hostile and like kind of the cold shoulder component at the same time, fighting regularly, rarely looking at each other, lack of eye contact's a big thing, lack of affection and support, right? Hostile engaged, where it's like frequent arguments, no balancing forces. It's a decent way of saying it, right? There's a lot of tension and not a lot of positive. Why this matters and why this is like, it's not like you're like, Mike, this isn't like a relationships class, but it actually is core, because of course relationships affect your psychology. I'm sure none of you are actually arguing that. I kind of just made up that you had that question, right? Like, and it's maybe not surprising that a breakdown of a relationship like that would have, kind of a wide-ranging effect, increased, and we can see this in things like, even kind of interesting things like increased likelihood of automobile accidents, which probably is linked to things like distraction and stuff like that, higher risks of suicide, higher risks of depression and all kinds of mental health related stuff, more absenteeism from work, kind of this like breakdown of function across the board in a negative way. Now, not always, right? Like, this is obviously, I'm saying like it's often associated with, not that it causes it, but it's often rough, right? And in the first part of the course, we were looking at divorce from the perspective of the kids. At this point in the course, we're looking at it from the perspective of the parents, sort of. So in today's presentation, we've been, just to go back to kind of the core of what, the essence of what we're talking about here is some of the big social and emotional things that are associated with this stage of early adulthood and adulthood in general. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about another psychologically relevant situation or experience that people have, this idea of postpartum depression, and how depression, specifically in the context of right after, like associated with pregnancy. So I think looking at this is quite interesting, and I can remember it's actually something that we've as a society learned quite a bit about, and this idea that like sometimes women after having a child can have this really disorienting experience of having wanted this so bad and then not feeling joy about it, and that there's actually biochemistry around that. And now we call it postpartum depression. We recognize that there's like a specific thing going on here, and I want to just talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So the stats on postpartum depression vary depending on obviously like where you're looking and stuff, and how the research was conducted. But you know, some studies have it as high as 25%, like 1 out of every 4 women or new mothers. And it's this experience of profound sadness for several weeks after birth. Now, I wanted to kind of go through this with you because it's sort of interesting, because what you'll notice, I'm going to say basically some of it's linked to steroids, or basically more women, if they have steroid hormones late in pregnancy, there seems to be a connection, which is sort of interesting because that's kind of on the nature or biology, kind of physical side of it. Whereas we also know that it's associated with things like when the pregnancy is unplanned or there's major life stresses around the pregnancy, which makes complete sense too, that the more stress factors in the external environment, that would have an effect. It'd be completely illogical for it to not have an effect, but it's the nature nurture thing is both having an influence here. And then the part I really want you to have is this idea that the best predictor of whether or not a woman will experience postpartum depression is whether or not they're pregnant. I mean, whether or not they're depressed during the pregnancy, right? So, and this is an important piece of information for you to know, potentially for your own personal life, potentially for your friend or your family, loved one, that if you have somebody in your life that's going through pregnancy and is experiencing a lot of depression, to keep an eye on this. Like now, my daughter was born at KW Hospital in downtown Kitchener, and I was given like some pamphlets and stuff about postpartum depression. So it's something that we're talking about more, and it's really important to, you know, understand the psychology of the situation, because it's really it's powerful biology at play, and also just if it's like almost 1 out of 4 women, I think this, you know, hopefully talking about it can take away any stigma people might feel about getting support, is kind of my point. So the developmental impact of parenthood. So think about the title there for a sec. Sorry, I should have had a drink before I started recording the slide. So one thing we see developmentally is a major decrease in sensation seeking. So it's like all of a sudden driving home from the hospital, I can remember this actually, like driving home from the hospital after Evie was born, and like it's like you hit a bump and you're like, oh Jesus, like are you okay, are you okay? It's like Julie's sitting in the back with her, and it's like I'm like hypersensitive all of a sudden. Sensation seeking declines, risky behavior decline. Now that's obviously on the drive home when I'm like a new dad. The most that effect probably ever had is in that moment almost. But it's like you see a general kind of across the board decrease in risky behavior. Marital satisfaction tends to decline. This is an interesting one because people after they have kids tend to rate their life satisfaction higher, but their marital satisfaction lower. For kind of obvious reasons, right? All of a sudden there's a lot more work kind of to be done, and a lot of the dissatisfaction can come from things like division of labor, basically who's doing what, especially in the middle of the night, who's getting up to change a diaper. Support from extended family can really help. Usually, like, yeah, support from extended family can really help. That's a huge point. Effective conflict resolution strategies increase satisfaction, which is kind of what I was saying before, is that if you can establish these patterns of dealing with stuff, you put yourself in a better position later when you're in a deeper level of complexity to navigate that successfully. Yeah, support from extended family. I can just think of like when Evie was born, it was like day 4 or something, and me and Julie are just so exhausted. And my mom came and just took Evie down to the guest room and just slept and took care of her for the night. And me and Julie just like slept the whole night and got up in the morning and we're like refreshed and like, okay, we can maybe do this. It's like the support of family can be so huge, especially early, and especially if it's a single parent situation. And single parents show a greater drop in satisfaction in life, which is quite interesting and obviously related to the increased demands. So if you look at this picture for a sec, it says across the bottom the stages of the life cycle: marriage, having your kids in preschool. This is obviously for family life cycle, so a couple with kids. Preschool, adolescence, last child leaves home. And then across the left side it says percentage of couples reporting that things between them are going well all the time. Right? So it's under half always, but it's this idea of like at marriage it's pretty high. As it becomes new parents, it's dropping. School age kids, it's like at its lowest, and then it starts to go up, and it doesn't kind of repass that initial level until almost retirement. Now again, marriage satisfaction is not the only thing, and it's linked with this idea of developing conflict resolution strategies, kind of all the stuff on the last slide, and increasing the kind of functionality of the parental unit, or if it's a single parent of their, well, then there's a lot of demand on them, their functionality, which is why it's so challenging, because the parent might also be trying to not just raise the child, but also, and take care of the house, but also support the family financially. Right? So there's just so much what in psychology we'd call role conflict. We've now officially reached the lightning round, which is a thing I made up to be the end of the presentation, where I just kind of fired through and re-hit some of the points, and this is just to kind of dig it in there deep in the memory so that when you do the quiz it's accessible. The first 20 years are important in predicting an adult's personality, but so are ongoing experiences in the adult years. Attachment styles, for example, reflect childhood patterns and continue to influence relationships in adulthood. Adult attachments are categorized as secure, avoidant, or anxious. A secure attachment style is linked with positive aspects of relationship. Costa and McCree, so I think I said this, and I think I had it as at least a subtitle, but Costa and McCrae, you might want to have written down, they're the people that made this Big Five personality index that includes openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. Oftentimes when people are in, you may have already learned this, but people often use the either ocean or canoe to remember those 5 things. Erickson theorized that intimacy versus isolation is the key developmental issue in early adulthood. That's kind of the main point today. Friendship plays an important role in adult development, especially in terms of emotional support. We talked about, and especially in the textbook, it goes a lot into this idea of like romantic love and affectionate love, and romantic love being kind of the passionate side, and affectionate love referring more to like this compassionate emotional connection. Romantic love, also called passionate love, includes passion, sexuality, and mixture of emotions. Affectionate love, also called companion love, usually becomes more important as the relationship matures. Sternberg proposed a triactic, meaning like a three-part model of love: passion, intimacy, and commitment. If all three qualities are present, the result is what he called consummate love. That'd be a good word to know for the test. If all three of those is present, consummate love. Gottman's research indicates that couples in successful marriages establish love maps, nurture fondness and admiration, turn towards each other, accept the influence of the partner, and create shared meanings. End of chapter 10 review. About an hour 25. Once you watch the video at the end, my times, I've said the time, how deep we are in this video a few times, but it's going to be all thrown off because of how I moved around some videos. But I have one final kind of classic piece of footage I want to show you. Technically the presentation is sort of over now, so if you're busy you can stop here, but I got some more classic Viktor Frankl here. See you soon. More information about the next assignment coming soon, and just thanks for being an awesome class. I know that this is tough times and you're all working really hard, and I respect that and appreciate it. Alright, reach out if you need anything, and I'd actually, on that point, I'd love to hear how you're doing. So cheers, take care, and I hope you enjoy this clip. See you soon.
In your work, you quote Nietzsche quite a bit. His line, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." What do you think he meant by that?
What I think,
What do you think he meant by that?
the same as I intended to convey to my readers and students, that the vision of a meaning ahead of someone, a meaning in wait for someone, to be fulfilled by someone, that this contributes most than anything else under equal other circumstances for survival.
Meaning is the most important thing in our lives?
Certainly, because what I call a will to meaning, the wish to find and to fulfill meaning, is the basic motivation in human beings.
Well, this certainly runs counter to much of the determinist notions that are being bandied around these days, as man is a machine, man is a computer, man is a product of instincts.
Man is something like a rat in experiments, psychological experiments. Of course, you're right, but not only against the so-called deterministic concepts of man, but also regarding the motivational theories of certain psychotherapeutic systems.
Let's talk for a minute about logotherapy, which arose out of this notion of a search for meaning.
Logotherapy, as one among other types of psychotherapy, is, we may say, a meaning-centered psychotherapy. Inasmuch particularly as logotherapy sees a human being not predominantly determined, not to say dominated, by the will to pleasure, as you were mentioning, nor by the will to power along the lines of Adlerian teachings, but basically, fundamentally, by a will to meaning. That is to say, the desire, the impulse to find, to discover in life, or better to say in each life situation, concrete life situation confronting someone, the desire to find a meaning therein and to go on to fulfill it.
I was very intrigued. One of the most surprising things I've read recently was that you said that when you talked to European students, only 40% said they had suffered this sort of inner void, and yet 81% of American students experience the same thing.
This was
now,
decades ago.
We think of it just the opposite. We think of the Europeans as being buried under this existential dread and sense of purposelessness, and Americans as being optimistic and upbeat.
However it might be, whether the ones or the others are suffering more or less respectively from this existential vacuum. The ones who seem to suffer less should not look at the others with contempt, but look at the others with compassion and look for anything possible to help the others.
Now, this void manifests itself as
In apathy, in boredom, lack of initiative, lack of interest in the world, or initiative in changing something within the world for the better. This frustration is a proof of the existence of a will to meaning. Unless we were imbued by will to meaning, by the wish to find meaning and discover and fulfill meaning in life, we never would be able to experience an inner void. So this is in a way also something positive.
Now, you've listed 3 types of values: creative values, experiential values, and attitudinal values.
And you may find a meaning. The average man, the man on the street or the woman on the street, may find a meaning day by day in doing a deed, in creating a work. And
that's the creative.
And in experiencing something, the beauty, the truth as a researcher, or the good in dealing with people as a teacher or whatsoever.
There's an extraordinary moment in Man's Search for Meaning where you talk about being in one of the Nazi camps and all of you going out to look at a sunset. Is that
exactly? This is a paradigm of experiential values, of finding a meaning in experiencing without doing anything, without achieving or accomplishing anything, but just in giving oneself to the immediate experience of something, say, beautiful going on in the world. Okay. This is the second avenue. But there is also another aspect of experiential values. Excuse me, not only experiencing something, but also experiencing someone. More than that, experiencing another human being in his or her very uniqueness. And it is the main attribute of a human being that he is a person in contrast to any animal. He is a person, and a person is always something absolutely unique, irrepeatable in the evolution of the cosmos, as it were, incomparable with any other human being. And this uniqueness can be got hold of solely by a loving person, because he not only sees the essence, but also the potentials in the beloved person, thereby, as I put it before, promoting him, alleviating it to reach out to attain this potential and to fulfill and thereby actualize also himself, but not by preaching self-actualization. It's nonsense. Self-actualization can only fall into your lap automatically once that you have fulfilled a concrete meaning, done the best of a situation. Then you actualize yourself as a byproduct.
Let's talk about the third set of values, which is the attitudinal, the idea of choosing how to respond to suffering.
Choosing the attitude.
Yes.
Yeah. If there is no possibility in a given situation to fulfill the meaning of a situation by giving oneself to the experience of beauty and so forth, nor to, if you have lost the capability to do your job, to do your work, even then there is an ultimate possibility to find and fulfill meaning. Not only the ultimate, it is even the potential to fulfill the deepest meaning, to attain the highest values. By your approach to the situation, a tragic or triste situation confronting you.
You said that in part of the initial shock of being put in a death camp was was ultimately an acceptance that we knew we had nothing to lose except our ridiculously naked lives. Is that the situation that they're in?
In a way.
Is this when you make the choice of how you're going to? Your last value choice is how to react to the situation?
You stood there naked, with nothing you could have had. But all the more what counted and mattered was what you were, being rather than having, possessing anything, or the being. So what counted was what you make out of this situation, with what attitude you adopt in the given situation. And there's a multitude, a wealth of possible attitudes to how to approach it. So you have to decide.
The ultimate, I would take it, attitudinal value challenge that we all share is how we're going to face death. How do you prepare people for that? How do you prepare yourself for that?
I couldn't prepare anyone else unless I would have prepared myself. Because if you are a psychiatrist, your patients feel exactly whether or not you are really convinced of what you are teaching and telling them. Now, I'm convinced that in contrast to the usual aspect, the albeit sound aspect to life, and more specifically to the past, to life's transitoriness, and this includes that we approach, each of us are approaching death. In contrast to that, I maintain that in the past, nothing is lost, but right on the contrary, everything is stored forever. It is not annihilated by transitoriness, but on the contrary, it is becoming preserved forever. Something you have done can never be undone. Something you have experienced, something you have even experienced in a negative sense, going through suffering. And if you have, for instance, if you have gone through this suffering, honestly, courageously, and with dignity, who in the world, what in the world can deny, can annihilate this? What you have done has been done forever, in both ways, in a negative as in a positive way. It cannot be undone. And the past is a storehouse of what you have done, what you have experienced, what you have gone through, and what you have done out of all the negative and tragic aspects as even encountered within your life.
I want to thank you for being on the show. And I want to thank you at home for watching.